We did homiletics a little while ago, and then we did my first sermon, and then I preached on this passage, so I'm re-preaching to you, but I tried to make it applicable to you as well. We're in James chapter 1, verses 1 to 12. I'm going to read it, the first 12 verses. James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes in the dispersion, greetings. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given to him. But let him ask in faith with no doubting, for the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. That person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. Let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation, and the rich in his humiliation, because like a flower of the grass he will pass away. For the sun rises with its scorching heat, and withers the grass, its flower falls, and its beauty perishes. So also the rich man will fade away in the midst of his pursuits. Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. So this summer I was working with a guy by the name of Joshua. Actually, I was working for him. We were on one of those big grain bins. You guys have those here when you come right into Swift. Those big cement grain bins. We were on a slip, like you slowly go up. It took like 10 days, double shift. You slowly go up, you're wheelbarrowing, shoveling. Good work. And my boss, his name was Joshua, and he told me a story of his life. When he was young, his brother promised him, I'll give you 10 grand. If you go to the military, you make it through basic training and you serve in the military. 10 grand. He's like, yes, 10 grand, I'm doing it. So he did it, he made it, served for 2 years. And then his brother said, I'll give you another 20 grand if you go through ranger training. And if you make that. And he was like so inspired. He wanted that 20 grand. That was his goal. So he endured some intense training. But he made it. And it's the basic training is like 15% of people that go through basic training make it. But then the people in ranger training, these are people who are already experienced soldiers, only less than half of the people that go through it make it. So it's intense. It's hard. But the testing that he went through, the reason he endured is because he had his eye on the goal, 20 grand. The believers in James's day, the people he's writing to, they were being tested severely. They needed a reminder of that goal, and they needed to realize that the struggle that you're going through, it's going to produce steadfastness, which in the end results in the crown of life. The background for the people he's writing to, I'm assuming you all know Acts. You probably know the Bible a lot better than me, like you've read it all your life. So Acts, the beginning where Pentecost happens, the church is born. Most of the people in the church are Jewish, because that's where the Holy Spirit fell upon the Jews. And then for the beginning of Acts, it's all about the church is spreading among the Jews. So there's already a very significant Jewish church. And then the leaders of the Jerusalem council, the Sanhedrin, who are opposed to the church, they start to challenge the church. And then Stephen, he actually rebukes them and tells them that they're not listening to the message of Jesus, these Jerusalem leaders. And they're so angry, they kill him. But then it's not only him that they're angry at the whole church. And then persecution just breaks out. And then we have a dispersion. The 12 tribes of Israel are scattered abroad in Judea, Samaria, places like that. But the apostles stay in Jerusalem. James stays in Jerusalem. That's what it says in Acts. So James is in Jerusalem. He's writing to the 12 tribes dispersed about. Being dispersed would have lost much. Probably a family. Like if we left Swift Current, if someone came in here and you had to run out from Swift Current, you'd leave family behind. Probably your job to provide for your family. Very difficult. From a worldly point of view, you've lost everything. But the testing of their faith that they were being tested with was to produce steadfastness, which would result in the crown of life. The passage 2 to 12, There's 3 words up top here in verses 2 to 4 and 3 words in 12. It's testing, trials, and steadfastness. And these 3 words, that's the struggle they're going through. And then the middle tells them what to do in the midst of this. They are to ask God to give wisdom to them. He gives liberally. If they don't know what's going on, ask God to give wisdom. He'll give it to you. But don't doubt. Don't be a wavering back and forth. Ask Him, trust Him. And don't look by outward appearance, because those who seem to have it good now, they're actually the ones whose end result will be destruction. But for you guys who are suffering now, your end result will be the crown of life. So those will be the things that we'll be talking about. There's the 2 types of people, those who are the dispersion, who are suffering. And then in James, there's another type of person. And he calls them the rich. And the rich in the book of James, it's not just people that are rich, because in the Bible there's people that are rich that God uses. But the rich in the book of James, they're actually the ones that are opposing the Christians in chapter 2. They're the ones who are blaspheming God, chapter 2. They're the ones who are causing the church troubles. And they're the ones who are treating unjustly, like they have their bosses and they have laborers, and maybe some of these laborers would even be the dispersion, the people that are dispersed. But they're not even paying them their wages. So these rich are corrupt, they're unjust. So part of the struggle of the Jews being dispersed was actually in their interactions with those rich. Like I said, in 2 to 3, well, actually I didn't bring this up yet. The Jews who are dispersed, they're still going to synagogues wherever they're at. And then there's rich people coming in, these unjust rich that I was talking about. And the believers that are suffering, they're looking at these people who have it well, and they're showing partiality. They're actually setting them above the poor people. The ones who look like they have it bad, they're setting those who look like they have it well in the world. They're looking like they're showing partiality to them. And James is like, why would you do that? They're the ones who are oppressing you. They're the ones who are blaspheming God's name. They're the ones who are causing you all this trouble. And yet, I'll give you some proof that this is what they're doing, that they're desiring the things that the rich have. In chapter 4, James talks about these dispersed believers. What are they asking for? He says, you covet, speaking to these dispersion, you covet and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You don't have because you don't ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly to spend it on your passions. And what would those passions be? Maybe they just want to go home. But for them to go home, that would mean they have to deny Jesus. Because they would have to go back to the people, the leaders of the Jerusalem council, and they'd admit that they didn't care about Jesus anymore, because if they did, they would kill them like they did Stephen. I actually met a brother in Winnipeg. He had gone through something very similar. And I want to use this story and then kind of try to see how this fits for us. This brother, his name was Javed. He's from Pakistan. This was about 8 years ago. He was working for an insurance broker in Pakistan. And then he's a faithful follower of Jesus. So his bosses or his coworkers would ask, why do you believe in Jesus? Well, the Bible says. Well, why don't you believe in Muhammad? Well, the Bible doesn't say anything about Muhammad. Well, why do you not believe in the Quran? Well, the Bible doesn't talk about the Quran. Like, he just denied anything that was opposed. So these Muslims wanted to charge him with blasphemy in Pakistan, which is death. But he wouldn't do it. Then one day, he was at home, him and his family, has 4 young daughters. One of them is, I guess, no, they're older than Hadassah. But 4 young daughters, and him and his daughters and his wife were at home, and then the Muslims came, broke the glass, wanted to kill him. Very similar to what these guys are going through. What he had to do was, I'll just say he was dispersed, I'll use that language. He had to flee to Thailand. And he was in Thailand for 7 years, in house arrest, in a room that's like, I think he explained it like this front pew, maybe to there in that wall, small room, for 7 years. Couldn't go out except a little distance from his house to a church nearby, so he did have some fellowship. But if he was seen in Thailand, what would happen is the people would probably export him back to Pakistan, and he would be thrown into a terrible prison. Just disgusting conditions. If you look it up, you'll see what I mean. And his daughters would probably be sold to other Islamic men, and you can imagine what they would do. So he's living under this pressure. And for him, the temptation could be to look at the people in Thailand who don't have to endure this, who aren't followers of Jesus, and think, man, why can they have it so easy? And he could even ask God, Lord, why do I have to go through this? Please give me back my home in Pakistan despite the cost. He would actually be asking for his own passions, because then he would have to deny Jesus to go back. But he endured. And through that, the testing of that faith, he's learned steadfastness, and he's becoming mature. It's beautiful. An example for us, like we do not struggle with this. We're not forced to obey God in that sense. Like for them, it's either obey God or stay in Jerusalem and deny him. For us, it's either obey God or don't obey God. But if we do, in a sense, if we don't obey him, if we do obey him, we don't risk losing our life. So our temptation can be not to, because we have it, like we kind of have it more of a choice. We're not being prodded to obey him. I think if that makes sense. Like you're not forced to disperse out in order to obey the Lord. You can sit right here and just live as you normally live and not obey him. You can sit right here and be willing to. That's a choice you have to make. I don't know, like for you guys, you're like a lot older than the faith than I am. But I know for young believers, it can be hard to go out and even share your faith. But it's like, if I want to obey Jesus, I need to go out. But no one's forcing me to. They were forced to go out to obey Jesus. So for us, for you, it's the question is, are you still striving to obey the Lord, even when you're not forced to? It's a choice you make. And I know, like, even for me, I'm only a 5-year-old Christian. As you grow older, it can be tempting to kind of slack off. And for you guys, you've been Christians for so long, I don't know if it can be tempting to just kind of ease back and not obey the Lord. But there's no retirement in the kingdom of heaven. It can be tempting as time goes on to stop pursuing him and being willing to endure those struggles. But those struggles that you choose to endure, that's the testing of your faith. It'll produce steadfastness. It'll result in a mature faith, and at the end, the crown of life. He says, in chapter 1 we read, he says, steadfastness should have its full effect, that they may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. And perfect in James, when he's talking about perfection here, he's not talking about sinlessness, but he's talking about being perfect and complete, full, lacking nothing. Like you have everything, you're mature. So for us, as we go on in our faith, as the years go on, and we struggle to obey the Lord, and we do sense that we're lacking, what should we do when we're lacking? For the Christians, if they were lacking perspective in the dispersion, they didn't know exactly what to do, they were looking at the things they were going through and struggling to know what the Lord was doing, they should ask God, who gives wisdom generously, liberally to all. They only need to ask. Their problem was they were asking for the wrong things. Like we said before, they were asking for their own passions. But God knows what they need. I'll give you an example. A butterfly, I don't know if you've ever heard this story, but when a caterpillar becomes a butterfly, the transformation is called metamorphosis. And then the caterpillar, I think it turns into a larva or something. I think that's the word. Some sort of cocoon thingamabob anyway. And then they hang there, and then God has designed this process to happen with this caterpillar to turn to a butterfly. That process is incredibly hard. It's difficult. It's a struggle. I just read the science of it, big words, but it's a struggle. It's hard. They fight. But if some compassionate soul, like my wife, perhaps, would see one of those poor creatures struggling, she might go over there with her deep, compassionate heart and be like, oh, I'll set that little creature free, and then slit it open, and then poop, it falls, dies. Game over. Because she didn't understand that God had designed the struggle of that caterpillar. He had designed it to make it strong so that once it transforms into a butterfly, it's beautiful. And now it's perfect and complete. It lacks nothing. It has everything it needs to live and do what God has called it to do. And for the Christians in James, like I said, they were asking for the wrong things because they didn't understand that the struggle that they were going through, just like the struggle for us to be willing to take up our cross and obey God and share our faith with people that's hard, that's what God has designed to produce this steadfastness in us. To make us mature, to make us complete, to make us beautiful like that butterfly. So they didn't understand, and we don't always understand, but we need to trust when we do struggle and we are lacking that God gives liberally to all. That's wisdom. But some people are wavering and unstable. This is a warning and a truth, and I've been here. Some people are, they doubt. They're like a wave of the sea, just back and forth, driven and tossed by the wind. And you could say that's what these believers were in some degree, because they're suffering the dispersion, but they were willing to flee their homes for Christ, but now they're going to desire the things of the world again, back and forth. Remember how I told you about Joshua? He struggled to endure that training. But one thing that gave him strength in that struggle was he was renewed in the promise of his brother. His brother's promise, he trusted his brother's character. And he trusted that his brother would give him the 20 grand. He just needed to endure, and then he'd get it. For us too, trusting in God's character, because God gives liberally to all. When we struggle, when we know we should obey him, but we're not finding the strength to do it. He gives liberally to all. Especially when they would be tempted to think the struggle isn't worth it. It's not worth losing my home. But what's the alternative? The alternative is to be like the world, to look at those who have it at ease and who are unjustly using what they have, like the rich. And James says in chapter 5 that those people have miseries coming upon them. They should weep and howl because they have miseries coming upon them, because they're not even giving the wages to their workers. They're being unjust. So it's better to struggle now and then receive the crown of life in obedience to the Lord than have everything easy and then encounter miseries. The people that are like a wave of the sea, they're double-minded, which is the opposite what we talked about before about a mature faith. Because double-mindedness, it's like two minds. It's not one. It's not complete. It's not mature. It's back and forth all the time. And there was people that were in this dispersion that were double-minded. It says in chapter 4 that they were double-minded, and the reason he uses that to show that they were double-minded is again that they were asking for the wrong things, not realizing the end result of that. And just for emphasis again on how we perceive things, like when we suffer or people that don't have to suffer, James 1:9-12 talks about the lowly brother and the rich, and he contrasts them. The lowly brother should boast in his exaltation, the rich in his humiliation, because this rich one, if he uses those riches unjustly, he'll pass away in the midst of his pursuits. And he's gained nothing, even though he looked like he had everything. But this lowly brother now, who's lost everything, he'll be exalted, and he'll gain the crown of life. For us, I know in a sense we could say in our culture, we are the rich, right? Like we are the ones that have a lot of possessions. But James is not condemning here all rich. But however, it's how do we use those? But for us, we can look at the world outside who doesn't obey God, and sometimes we could be tempted to think they don't have to struggle with the fact that the world is going to hell because they're not even thinking about it. It's not their mind. They don't struggle. They just live for themselves. But for us, we're called to consider other people's needs above our own. We're called to share the gospel. We're called to care for others. That can be hard. We could be tempted to look at those who don't have to struggle with these things and think, man, I wish I just had it like them. I didn't have to worry about people who are suffering and care about them. It could be a temptation because we struggle against the flesh. But James says, those people, what's their end result? What will be their end? But what will yours be when you continue to endure, when you can continue to obey God? As you get older, as you continually obey Him, your result will be a crown of life. Beautiful. Worth way more than any of this riches on this earth now, if you use them in a wicked way. I have a phenomenal example of this, and I know we're not all called to the same thing, so I don't want to make this sound like this is the ultimate and you should all compare yourself to this. But we have a brother at Bible school. His name is Mr. Kirsch. Maybe some of you know him, Dennis Kirsch. He's such an example to me because he's like 79 years old, and he tells me one thing that he does for his ministry to the Lord, he wants to be faithful, is him and his wife, they both have computers, and then they email people across the world, and they lead people to Christ, and they disciple them, and they're actively pursuing obedience to the Lord. For them, he sees it, like there's no retirement in the kingdom of heaven. And he's actively serving the Lord. So yeah, I guess it feels weird to exhort you all to this, because you could probably exhort me because you've gone through way more trials than I have. But I guess just as an encouragement, we must be willing to be refined and remain steadfast when circumstances are contrary to our desires, because that steadfastness will produce the crown of life. Just because from a worldly standpoint we might look like the ones who are at loss, it's not true. So with the eyes of faith you can see we're the ones who will receive the reward. But the call is to remain faithful. Maybe, I don't know, I guess it's hard in this COVID time. I could say we could all be encouraged. Maybe this week, if we see someone, we can ask God, maybe we can share Christ with someone, or just actively continue to pursue the Lord. And the end result of that will be the crown of life. Circumstances, again, must not determine our trust in God, otherwise we'll be unstable. That's all I have, and I hope it's useful for you.